All right, just 6 days until Election Day, and Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump are stumping in some key battleground states. Both candidates will be making stops in North Carolina and Wisconsin today. Harris is also headed to Pennsylvania for a rally at the state capitol. More than 53 million Americans have already cast their votes, and more than 27 million of those were in-person early votes. Harris spoke directly to future voters from Washington yesterday and promised unity and bipartisanship under her administration.
I am looking to make progress. I pledge to listen to experts, to those who will be impacted by the decisions I make, and to people who disagree with me. Unlike Donald Trump,
I want to bring in CBS News political director Fin Gómez, who was there last night in front of the White House, or with the White House as the backdrop, as the vice president delivered her final message to potential voters. So, Finny, among those very strong sentiments, she had warnings about Donald Trump stepping into office. But I thought one of the key moments, Finn, in her speech was when she pointed the juxtaposition of the way that she would treat people that disagree with her. She said the former president has threatened to jail folks who disagree with him, and she said that she would give them a seat at the table.
Yeah, I think that was a really strong point last night there at that rally. There was an estimation that was as large as maybe 75,000 people. It was a large crowd, Vlad, it really was. And it was intended to be this driving last closing argument message of her campaign, which is, as you mentioned, 6 days away until Election Day. I think that it was notable, what you just referenced, Vlad. There was this line that she said, on day one, I'm going to bring my to-do list. On day one, Donald Trump's going to bring his enemies list. And I think that really encapsulated like the overall sentiment and tenor of that speech last night. It was offering a big contrast between what she will offer, she says, as president, in contrast to Donald Trump. And instead of offering a more hopeful, optimistic approach to one filled with dark rhetoric. And I think that was her intended point to make. And also, just a reminder, Vlad, it was done where, that same location on January 6, 2021, where former President Trump held that Stop the Steal rally. Of course, that was then followed by the attack on the Capitol.
As you know, Finn, earlier on CBS Mornings, we spoke with Democratic Vice Presidential nominee Governor Tim Walz. I want to play a bit of what he had to say.
You saw a presidential speech last night at the Ellipse that is the best of America, one that's talking about unifying us, one that's talking about bringing folks to the table, one that the American tradition of disagreeing and debating, but still doing it in a respectful manner. And I think there's the frustration we've seen since January 6th, the frustration with Donald Trump's rhetoric of division. It does fire passions.
Yeah, the rhetoric of division, Finn, let's just talk a little bit about that. The former president was asked yesterday in an interview about the comments that were made at his rally in New York City at Madison Square Garden over the weekend, where one of the speakers in support of his campaign, called the island of Puerto Rico garbage, and thus, by extension, Puerto Ricans garbage. The president, again, not apologizing for it. He said it was a night of love, if I'm paraphrasing there. He said it was a night of love fest. Yeah, love fest. What's the takeaway there?
I think it's sort of the SOP that we've been seeing from former President Trump. And look, Vlad, I've been covering him since 2015. Actually, the first rally I covered of his was in 2011 in West Palm Beach. And this is something that you see. It's the SOP from Donald Trump. There's no apology, right? There's never, I think the closest thing we saw to apology was that night when I spoke to a senior advisor on the campaign who says that the message from that comedian did not align with what the president believes or former president believes. So, but it's also like this has been picking up speed. It has for the last few days. And again, going back to where it has an impact, it could have an impact in that in crucial electorate in the battleground state of Pennsylvania, the Latino corridor just north of Philadelphia that encompasses Bethlehem, Allentown, and some other parts of the state that make up the majority of Latino voters in that state. And this, the Harris campaign believes that this could be something that can move the dial, that can mobilize Latino voters and black voters, and can also have an impact, Vlad, in places like Nevada and Arizona, where there's a large percentage of Latino voters, Vlad.
Finn, before I let you go, we got to talk about President Biden. We we should be talking about this message that the vice president delivered yesterday, but the president of the United States, Joe Biden, stepped into it again yesterday when he seemed, in the choice of words that he used to describe those comments at Madison Square Garden, to be calling supporters of the former president garbage. Now, the White House has walked that back. Tell me what the White House is saying now, what the Biden administration is saying to rectify what I'm sure the vice president does not want to be talking about this morning.
Well, that's absolutely right, Vlad. And I obtained that video last night that had the president's remarks saying that essentially it did sound like he was referring to former President Trump's supporters as garbage. But and it has echoes of 2016, that whole, the deplorable line from Hillary Clinton then. There are some contrasts to then. However, Vlad, the President Biden is not the nominee. That's Vice President Harris. And yeah, the White House has tried to clean it up, saying it was it was an apostrophe, that he was talking more about the hateful rhetoric from the rally. However, it is having an impact. There is some frustration from Harris campaign officials that I spoke to this morning. One of them said it was dumb that he said this, and another one said it was just distracting at a time when the vice president's making her closing argument. So we'll see how it plays out. But again, the other aspect of it is it takes away from the headlines out of the Madison Square Garden rally with that racist and hateful rhetoric that did emanate from that rally just a couple of days ago.
All right, Fin Gómez breaking it down for us as always. Thanks, Fin. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Vlad.